Welcome back to my channel. My name is Kayla and I like to discuss books, reading, Song of Ice and Fire, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, food, really whatever I feel like. So if any of that randomness appeals to you, then please subscribe. Today I'm going to be talking about White Walkers and how these mythical creatures represent the very real threat of climate change. This is by no means a theory that I have come up with completely on my own. This theory has been long discussed and is something that I just can't claim as an original idea. However, it is a theory that makes a lot of sense to me and has actually even had some confirmation from George R.R. Martin himself. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I thought I'd dive into this a little bit more and just explore some of the ways in which White Walkers represent or are a metaphor for climate change. Throughout this video, I will be referring to the others as White Walkers, even though the books primarily refer to them as the others. This is really just to make things a little bit more consistent and cohesive and avoid any confusion. So I'm just going to use that term because I feel like it's easier. I'm going to be discussing three main similarities between climate change and White Walkers that provide some support for this metaphor or theory. So, without any more explanation, let's just get into the first similarity, and that is that White Walkers are an existential threat. Like climate change, White Walkers present a threat to the comfort, safety, and existence of humanity. The myth or story of the long winter or the long night has the potential to make the world essentially uninhabitable. So children of the forest and the people in the north have even raised a wall, obviously the wall, to protect from these insidious beings and this really pervasive threat. This actually draws an almost direct parallel to the very expensive walls that are being raised around coastal cities to accommodate rising sea levels from climate change. This parallel actually continues really nicely in that this threat does not affect every area equally. Obviously, sea level rise and increased droughts are going to be affecting warmer areas and coastal cities much sooner and much more intensely, in the same way that White Walkers are going to be a more urgent threat for northerners and wildlings in Westeros. Though obviously both of these things are going to reach every end of the earth in some way or another, but it definitely affects certain areas disproportionately, and I think that just bolsters this metaphor a little bit more. Another point worth mentioning is the origins of the White Walkers as an experimental dark magic. Obviously, we don't know a ton about their origins. We have little bits and pieces, and I'm hoping that this is elaborated on a little bit more in Winds of Winter. George R.R. Martin has said he's going to elaborate on this more. From what we know, they originate from this sort of experimental dark magic. This is actually a great comparison to our intensive use of fossil fuels, which of course draws a parallel to that experimental dark magic, including the unintended negative effects or consequences. In the case of climate change. In the case of White Walkers. But obviously those were probably not the intentions when people started doing those things. This comparison also indicates that White Walkers were created by intelligent beings, humans or children of the forest is what we are kind of familiar with, in the same way that climate change is anthropogenic or created by humans. So again, this just seems to bolster the metaphor that much more, but I thought it was a nice little tidbit to include. The second main comparison that I was kind of drawing in my head between climate change and White Walkers is political distraction and inaction. So the political machinations of various parts of Westeros in the story are initially in the foreground, with the threat of the White Walkers being so distant that it's really of no real concern, and in fact A lot of people don't believe it, but we'll kind of touch on that a little bit more later. As the story progresses, however, it is revealed that White Walkers are a much more serious and tangible threat than initially or originally thought. The political movers that seemed so important before are suddenly much more insignificant, and current White Walker preventative measures, such as the Wall and the Night's Watch, are simply not enough. If this sounds familiar, it's probably because it is. This really is not that much different than our own political agendas and lobbyists getting in the way of real climate action. George R.R. Martin himself has actually spoken on this topic, saying, "We're fighting over issues. Important issues, mind you. Foreign policy, domestic policy, civil rights, social responsibility, social justice. All of these things are important. But while we're tearing ourselves apart over this and expending so much energy, there exists this threat of climate change, which, to my mind, is conclusively proved by most of the data and 99.9% of the scientific community. And it really has the potential to destroy our world, and we're ignoring that while we worry about the next election and issues that people are concerned about. All of these things are important issues, but none of them are important if, like, we're dead and our cities are under the ocean." Well said, George. So ultimately, these political games are a distraction from the bigger, albeit more distant problem. So it really goes together that there is this political distraction, then as a result of it, political inaction. The third similarity that I want to draw between climate change and White Walkers is denial in the face of mounting evidence. This is not necessarily addressed much yet in the books, but in the show it is, and I would imagine that it will be addressed a little bit more in The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring, if those ever see the light of day. As the series progresses, the evidence of and the encounters with White Walkers become greater and greater, and it is clear that this is a real problem. Yet, even when faced with this, members of the Night's Watch hesitate to come together with the wildlings to fight this common enemy. It's actually so unpopular that it lands our boy Jay Snow in some pretty hot water with his Night's Watch homies, but that's a whole nother thing. Then, even when undeniable evidence is presented, there is still outright denial. This is very similar to climate change denial, and I won't get into the psychology of it too much, but I did listen to a great audiobook called The Psychology of Climate Change Denial. I think that's what it was called. I will link it in the description box below if you have any interest in that. It was really interesting and very eye-opening. But essentially, one of the main drivers of climate change denial in particular is just the sheer vastness of the problem. It is so big and slow-moving that many people honestly just can't really even comprehend it, so they just deny the reality. I get it. It's a very overwhelming problem, so that makes a lot of sense to me. I think I can kind of understand some of that psychology behind it. It's a real bummer. Anyway, even when there is visible and tangible evidence, the denial often ends up then shifting into, that may be true, but it's someone else's problem to fix. This is sort of how Cersei ends up dealing with it in season 8 of the show. Again, we don't really know what's going to happen in the books, but I think it's safe to assume that it could go a similar direction. It is also a common method of disassociation for climate change denial. So again, because the reality of the problem is just too big to fully process, a lot of people just put it off or try to say it's kind of not their problem to solve, which, yeah. There's a lot behind that. As I said, I'm not going to unpack it. I'm just here to draw the similarities and the parallels between climate change and White Walkers. But again, I will link that audiobook below. I don't know if it's an actual book. I just listened to the audiobook. Very insightful, but also very dry narration. So anyway, I'm not really sure how to wrap up this video, except that clearly White Walkers are a metaphor for climate change, and when looking at the existential threat, political distractions, denial, and even ineptitude at addressing the problem, it's honestly a pretty spot-on comparison. Will Westeros be able to set aside power plays and come together to address this existential threat and common enemy? Will we? Only time will tell. hopefully not too much time. That's going to be it for this video though. Please like if you enjoyed it, leave a comment, and let me know below if you'd like to see any more videos that are similar to this. This was a really interesting idea for me to kind of think about, so I would definitely be interested in making more like this. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I will see you later.